It was a crisp Saturday morning when I first spotted the envelope, its dreaded HOA logo glaring at me from inside my mailbox. Even before I touched it, a sinking feeling twisted my gut. HOA letters never brought good tidings. They weren't about friendly reminders or holiday cheer. They were harbingers of fines, warnings, and thinly veiled threats dressed up as official notices. I yanked it out, the weight of impending doom settling in as I tore it open, only to find a notice so absurd it bordered on comical. A $200 fine for an unauthorized lawn ornament. I blinked, reread it, and stared in disbelief. It was about my garden gnome, a tiny, harmless fellow with a fishing rod and a cheeky grin, a gift from my grandmother last Christmas. She said it would bring me luck, but apparently it had only summoned the wrath of the HOA. The letter dripped with that smug, overly formal tone HOA documents always carried, as if they were some grand institution rather than a nosy suburban clique with too much time and power. I glanced at the gnome perched near my flower bed, his little rod held patiently, looking anything but menacing. Yet here he was, branded a neighborhood scourge. My yard was pristine, lawn trimmed, flowers neatly arranged, not a weed in sight. Still, the HOA deemed this single ceramic fisherman a violation worthy of a fine. As I processed the ridiculousness, I heard the unmistakable click of confident, self-important heels on the sidewalk. Karen, the HOA president, was approaching. Clipboard in hand, nose tilted just so, she radiated the aura of someone who thought she ruled the block. Karen wasn't just any member. She was the tyrant-in-chief, thriving on her self-appointed authority over every blade of grass and mailbox angle. She had no hobbies beyond enforcing rules, no personality beyond her obsession with community standards, and no purpose but to ensure nobody enjoyed themselves too much. She stopped, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at her lips. "You're in violation, Mr. Reynolds," she declared, as if I hadn't just read her petty decree. I forced a smile. "It's a garden gnome, Karen." Her smirk widened. "It's an unauthorized lawn ornament, Section 5, Article 3 of the Guidelines." I raised an eyebrow. "One gnome, really?" Her eyes gleamed with the glee of petty tyranny. "Rules are rules," she chirped, tilting her head like she was lecturing a dim child. "Remove it within a week or the fine doubles." I stared at her, hopping for a crack in her facade, a hint this was a joke. But Karen didn't joke. She lived for this, feeding off the misery she inflicted. "Seriously, $200 for a tiny statue?" I pressed. She didn't flinch. "And $400 if it's still here in 7 days, she snapped, then strutted off, her heels clicking triumphantly. I stood there, letter in hand, gazing at the gnome. He didn't look guilty, just sat there grinning, oblivious to the chaos he'd sparked. At first, I considered caving. Maybe it wasn't worth the fight. But as Karen's smug retreat replayed in my mind, alongside every absurd citation she'd ever issued, trash bins out too long, grass a hair too tall, something snapped. This wasn't just about the gnome. It was about her relentless crusade to micromanage our lives. A slow, mischievous smile crept across my face. If she hated one gnome, how would she handle 500? The idea hit me like a lightning bolt, absurd, petty, and utterly perfect. I spent the afternoon plotting, scouring online stores and local shops for gnomes. By sunset, sipping a beer on my porch, I whispered to my little ceramic general, "This is just the beginning." He grinned back, ready for war. The next morning, I launched my mission with the fervor of a man possessed, determined to transform my yard into a gnome empire that would make Karen rue the day she targeted my little fisherman. I started with the obvious spots: home improvement stores, garden centers, and big box retailers, scouring every aisle for those bearded rebels. At first, the haul was modest. A few gnomes here, some with lanterns, others with fishing rods, a couple pushing tiny wheelbarrows. I didn't care about their style or size. They were all conscripted into my army. But the stores quickly ran dry, so I pivoted to thrift shops and second-hand stores where the real treasures hid. There, I unearthed faded gnomes with chipped paint, hatless ones with weathered grins, and even a few handmade oddities that barely resembled gnomes at all, perfectly imperfect recruits. I haggled with shopkeepers, bought in bulk, and even sweet-talked a flea market vendor into selling me his entire stash at a discount. By day's end, my car was a rolling gnome fortress, their painted eyes peering at me as if they knew they were part of something epic. But I wasn't done. Online marketplaces became my next battlefield. I placed bulk orders, bid on auctions, and arranged late-night pickups from strangers' porches, transactions that felt more like covert ops than garden decor deals. One guy, handing over a box of glow-in-the-dark gnomes, squinted at me and asked, "What are you doing with all these?" I grinned, "Starting a revolution." He nodded, handed me the goods, and didn't press further. By the time the deliveries rolled in, my house was a gnome war zone, garage floor buried, living room overrun, guest bedroom stacked with ceramic warriors waiting for deployment. Standing amid the chaos, hands on hips, I felt a surge of triumph. This was going to be glorious. The night before the grand reveal, I worked under darkness's cover, placing each gnome with care. Clusters stood guard by my flower beds, others huddled in chatty groups. A few hid in bushes, their faces peeking out like spies. Lantern-bearing gnomes lined the walkway to my door, while fishing gnomes circled the mailbox, as if guarding a sacred pond. By sunrise, my lawn was a full-blown gnome sanctuary, hundreds of them, unblinking and cheerful, a masterpiece of defiance. I didn't have to wait long for the fireworks. At 7 a.m., a scream shattered the suburban quiet, shrill, furious, unmistakably Karen's. I turned, coffee in hand, to see her on the sidewalk, bathrobe flapping, clipboard trembling in her grip. Her face was a glorious shade of enraged red as she gawked at the gnome invasion. She stood frozen, mouth flapping like a stranded fish, too overwhelmed to speak. Her eyes darted from gnome to gnome, realization dawning. This was no accident, this was war. What is this?" she finally squeaked, her voice cracking. I strolled off my porch, casual as ever. "Morning, Karen, something wrong?" She jabbed a shaky finger at my yard. This is a violation, an abomination, you can't do this." I sipped my coffee, smirking. "Actually, I can. The guidelines only ban an individual lawn ornament, no limit specified. I'm just interpreting creatively." Her eyes bulged, her knuckles whitening around her clipboard. "This is harassment," she shrieked. "A mockery of community standards," I nodded thoughtfully. "Well, rules are rules." She choked out a strangled noise, hissed, "This isn't over," and stormed off, her bathrobe billowing dramatically. I watched her go, barely stifling laughter. Her reaction was better than I'd dreamed. She'd call an emergency meeting, send frantic emails, waste her energy fighting this. It was beautiful. My yard was now the neighborhood spectacle, and the rebellion had just begun. The aftermath of my gnome invasion turned my yard into an instant neighborhood sensation, a beacon of absurdity that drew stares, laughs, and whispers from every corner of the block. Cars slowed as they passed, drivers gawking at the sea of ceramic faces. Neighbors paused mid-step, snapping photos and chuckling at the sheer lunacy of it all. A few even stopped by to slap me on the back, dubbing it the ultimate HOA rebellion. High praise I hadn't expected but happily accepted. But the real magic happened when Mrs. Thompson, my next-door neighbor, stepped onto her porch that morning. She surveyed my gnome army with a sly smile, then casually placed a single gnome by her mailbox, a silent pledge of allegiance. By day's end, more followed suit, a gnome here, two there, popping up along the street like defiant little mushrooms. Karen's worst nightmare was unfolding. My rebellion was contagious, spreading faster than she could stomp it out. That night, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset gild my gnome empire, I felt a deep, smug satisfaction. She started this over one tiny statue. Now she'd see what happened when you pushed too far. Karen didn't waste a second mounting her counterattack. Within 24 hours, she'd summoned an emergency HOA meeting, flooding the neighborhood with flyers, emails, and door-to-door pleas, painting my gnomes as a dire threat to aesthetic integrity and community order. Her version of events was pure theater. I hadn't just decorated. I'd unleashed chaos, practically paving the way for lawlessness and roller coasters in backyards. I decided to attend, if only for the entertainment. Arriving early, I took a seat in the back, watching Karen pace like a general rallying troops. The HOA board sat stiffly behind a table, already weary, as neighbors trickled in, whispering and stifling grins. This was the biggest scandal in years, and everyone was here for the show. Karen launched into her tirade, slamming papers down with a flourish. "This is a disgrace," she barked, her voice cutting through the room. "We have rules for a reason, standards, decorum, and some people," she glared at me, "think they can mock them." She waved a photo of my yard like it was a smoking gun. "This is the chaos festering in our peaceful neighborhood." A cough masked a laugh up front. Someone muttered, "It's just gnomes." Karen's eyes twitched and she slammed a pen on the table. We cannot let this stand. I propose an immediate ban on all gnome-related decorations, 72 hours to remove them or fines. The room buzzed with murmurs. A few nodded, but most looked dubious. Mr. Thompson raised his hand. Karen, is this really worth an emergency meeting? They're not hurting anyone. Her nostrils flared. It's about principle. If we allow tacky decorations, what's next? Plastic flamingos, inflatable Santas. I leaned forward. It ends with people enjoying their own property without you policing every detail. Her glare could have melted steel. You're violating standards, I smirked. No, I'm within your rules, no limit on gnomes, just a ban on one. I got creative. Chuckles rippled through the crowd. Karen turned purple. Mrs. Delgado piped up. I think they're funny. My grandkids love them. We've got bigger worries. Karen faltered, but the knockout blow came from Susan, a quiet board member. Even if we pass this, bylaws don't apply retroactively. Mr. Reynolds' gnomes are grandfathered in. Silence, then snickers. My grin widened. So they're staying? Karen's fists clenched. She was trapped by her own rules. The meeting ended with her storming out, muttering vengeance. She wasn't done, I knew that, but neither was I. The neighborhood was watching, and the gnomes were multiplying. Karen's defeat at the meeting didn't mark the end of her campaign. It only stoked her desperation, turning her petty vendetta into a full-blown siege. The next day, my garbage bins vanished, mysteriously misplaced, though I was the only one affected. A coincidence? Hardly. I pictured Karen smirking as she pulled strings with some obscure HOA connection. Then came the citations, a barrage of nitpicking fines. Grass a fraction too tall, a hairline crack in my driveway, a mailbox allegedly tilting a degree off plumb. It was laughable, a frantic grasp at control, but what she didn't anticipate was the neighborhood's shift. Before, her antics might have gone unnoticed, but post-Gnome rebellion, people were paying attention. They'd seen her unravel over ceramic statues, and now they fought back. Reports of Karen's own violations started trickling in, her hedges slightly too high, bins left out past curfew. The same tactics she'd wielded for years were boomeranging, and my gnome army grew daily, fueled by neighbors inspired to join the fray with their own bearded rebels. By week's end, nearly every yard on the block sported at least one gnome, some subtle, peeking from flower beds, others bold, lining driveways like sentinels. Karen was losing her grip, and she knew it. Her escalation hit a new low when I woke one morning to find my lawn tampered with, not vandalized exactly, but rearranged. Gnomes lay toppled, piled chaotically, some flipped upside down like a tiny ceramic disaster had struck. Kids, I thought at first, until I spotted the footprints, small, neat, left by stiff, polished shoes. Karen had snuck in at night, frantically upending my army in a fit of rage. The image of her skulking through my yard was so absurd I nearly laughed aloud. I only wished I'd caught it on camera. Instead of anger, I saw opportunity. That afternoon, I restored the gnomes, but with a twist. I turned every single one, hundreds of them, to face her house. The next morning, she stepped out, coffee in hand, and froze. Her face twisted in horror as she met the unblinking stares of my ceramic legion. Her hands shook, coffee sloshing, before she retreated indoors, likely yanking the blinds shut to escape their gaze. That should have been her breaking point, but Karen doubled down. Later that day, a city inspector arrived, clipboard in hand, exhaustion etched on his face, the look of a man dragged into someone else's mess. "We got a complaint about excessive lawn decorations," he sighed, rubbing his temples. I grinned. "Let me guess, my lovely HOA president?" He didn't confirm, just muttered. "She's called us 4 times this week." I gestured to the gnomes. "Is this a violation?" He scanned the yard, flipped through his notes. "No ordinance against gnomes unless they block sidewalks or pose a hazard. You're fine." He clearly wanted out. I made it easy. "I'll spread them out a bit, give her less to complain about." He nodded gratefully and left. I tweaked the layout, less dense, more natural, but ensured every gnome still stared at Karen's house. She must have realized the city wouldn't help because her next move was wilder. She called the police. I was sipping iced tea on my porch when a patrol car rolled up. 2 officers stepped out, looking baffled. "We got a call about intimidation via lawn decorations," the mustached one said, glancing at his notepad. I set my drink down. "Am I under arrest for gnome crimes?" The other, a woman, smirked. "No, just checking there's no real threat." I waved at the gnomes. "Unless they're secretly menacing, I think we're good," she chuckled. "We'll call it a non-issue, but you're HOA president." "She's persistent," I sighed. "Tell me about it." They drove off, and I shook my head. Karen had officially lost it, and I was winning. Corinne's call to the police marked the peak of her unraveling, a desperate swing that only deepened her descent into neighborhood infamy. By now, whispers about her absurdity buzzed through the block. People who'd once shrugged off her petty fines were openly mocking her gnome obsession. Her every failed attempt to crush my rebellion made her look more unhinged, and I wasn't the only one reveling in it. Neighbors started rallying, some just to tweak her nose, others genuinely fed up with her reign. That night, Mrs. Thompson texted me a photo, a new gnome by her mailbox captioned, "Long live gnomes." I grinned. Corinne had declared war, but I was winning and her iron grip was slipping. The rebellion wasn't just mine anymore, it had ignited something bigger. People who'd cowered under her clipboard were rolling their eyes as she passed, and gnomes kept sprouting, sometimes one or two, sometimes whole squads strategically placed to catch her eye. A giant inflatable gnome even appeared at the neighborhood entrance. Sign reading, "Welcome to Gnomeville." No one claimed it, and Corinne's furious bids to remove it went nowhere. She wasn't taking it well. Her morning patrols stopped, no more smug glances or clipboard waving. She turned reclusive, darting between house and car, avoiding eye contact, a shadow of the tyrant who'd once ruled every lawn. The shift was palpable. The woman who'd thrived on control was now trapped, surrounded by the gnomes she'd tried to banish. Then came the tipping point. A petition started circulating, quiet at first, just a few signatures on a whispered plan to oust her. But as her antics grew wilder, police calls, late-night gnome flipping, the effort snowballed. It wasn't just about my yard anymore. It was years of her fines, harassment, and bullying boiling over. The HOA bylaws allowed a president's removal with enough votes, a rule Corinne, in her arrogance, never thought would turn on her. She'd assumed her power was untouchable, but now the neighbors she'd tormented were uniting, tasting freedom from her shadow and refusing to let it return. When she caught wind of the petition, she snapped into full meltdown mode. Corinne went door to door pleading her case, but it was a disaster. Polite indifference met her at best. At worst, outright laughter sent her packing. Even her loyalists peeled away, sensing her inevitable fall. No one wanted to sink with her ship. The final HOA meeting was a spectacle, the room packed with faces I'd never seen at these things before. An electric hum filled the air, neighbors exchanging sly glances as Corinne sat up front, sweating, clutching her clipboard like a lifeline. Her usual swagger was gone, replaced by raw panic as she scanned for allies and found none. The vote was swift and merciless. An overwhelming majority stripped her of her title. Applause erupted, some cheered, others clapped politely, but the message rang clear. Her era was over. She stood, knocking her chair over, mouth gaping for one last rant, but no words came. No one cared anymore. She stormed out, slamming the door, a defeated figure in a war she'd started and lost. The next morning, a "for sale" sign stabbed her lawn, fittingly unkempt with stray weeds, as a moving truck rumbled in her driveway. I watched from my porch as she packed, her once pristine image shattered. When the movers finished, I grabbed a favorite gnome, scribbled a note. "May this gnome bring you luck in your new neighborhood," and set it on her step. She emerged, box in arms, and froze, eyes flicking from the gnome to me. I braced for a scream, a final outburst, but she just stared, expression unreadable, then turned, got in her car, and drove off. That night the neighborhood celebrated, lawn chairs, drinks, a rare lightness in the air. Corinne was gone, and my gnomes had won. Corinne's departure didn't just mark the end of her reign. It was a liberation, a collective exhale after years of her suffocating rule. That night, as neighbors spilled onto lawns with chairs and beers, the air buzzed with a freedom we hadn't felt in ages. The new HOA board, sane folks who cared about people, not power, wasted no time overturning the absurd lawn ornament ban. Gnomes were officially legal, their victory cemented. I stood in my yard, surveying my ceramic warriors, their bearded faces glinting in the dusk. What began as petty revenge had morphed into a neighborhood revolution, and my little rebels were now a permanent fixture, joined by neighbors' own collections dotting the block. The Gnomeville sign still loomed at the entrance, a cheeky monument to our triumph. Corinne's house sat empty, her "for sale" sign a silent surrender, and I couldn't help but smirk. She'd never escaped the gnome's legacy, no matter where she fled. The rebellion's ripple effects lingered in subtle, satisfying ways. People who'd once kept their heads down now waved cheerfully as I passed, their own gnomes winking from flower beds or perched on porches. Corinne's absence left a void she'd never imagined. Her control had been her identity, and without it, she'd crumbled. The neighborhood felt lighter, less policed, as if her exit had lifted a weight we'd all carried too long. My gnome army, once a personal jab, had become a symbol, a middle finger to petty tyranny, a reminder that even the smallest defiance could topple a giant. I'd catch Mrs. Thompson tending her lone gnome, grinning at me like we shared a delicious secret, or see kids giggling as they darted past my yard, pointing at the fishing gnomes by the mailbox. Even the HOA meetings shifted. Fewer rules, more laughter, a focus on community over clipboard crusades. But I wasn't naive. Corinne's type didn't vanish quietly. I half expected her to resurface, maybe in some new suburb, terrorizing fresh victims with her ruler and fines. Wherever she landed, though, she'd carry the sting of this defeat. That gnome I'd left on her step wasn't just a parting shot, it was a promise. The gnomes had won, and she'd never outrun them. Back here, the block settled into a new rhythm. My yard remained the epicenter, a sprawling gnome sanctuary that drew curious glances from delivery drivers and dog walkers alike. Some neighbors got creative. One rigged a gnome with a tiny solar light. Another staged a barbecue scene with miniature aprons. The absurdity kept us bonded, a shared joke that outlasted Corinne's wrath. I'd sit on my porch, beer in hand, marveling at how one $200 fine had sparked this chaos, and how beautifully it had ended. As weeks passed, the for sale sign vanished from Corinne's lawn, a new family moving in, nice people unburdened by her baggage who chuckled at my gnomes and added one of their own. The rebellion's fire cooled, but its embers glowed in every yard. I'd won more than a battle, I'd helped rewrite the neighborhood's story. The gnomes weren't just decorations, they were proof you could fight back, that a little mischief could dismantle a dictator. Sipping my beer one evening, I toasted my original gnome, still grinning by the flower bed. "You started this, little guy?" I murmured. He didn't reply, but his fishing rod seemed to gleam with pride. Corinne was gone, her kingdom fallen, and Gnomeville thrived in her wake. It was a victory sweeter than I'd ever planned, a testament to the power of standing up, or in this case, planting down. The gnomes had prevailed, and they always would. With Corinne gone and the neighborhood reborn, my gnome empire settled into its role as both a quirky landmark and a quiet legend. The new family in her old house fit right in, tossing a gnome into their yard with a grin. No clipboard tyrants here, just people happy to live and let live. The block's vibe had shifted for good. Where Corinne's patrols once cast a shadow, now there was ease, a sense of playfulness woven into the fabric of our daily lives. My lawn remained the heart of it all, a sprawling testament to defiance, its hundreds of gnomes standing like cheerful sentinels. Neighbors still added to the lore. Mr. Thompson rigged a gnome with a motion sensor laugh, startling joggers at dawn, while Mrs. Delgado's grandkids staged tiny gnome tea parties in her garden. The Gnomeville sign at the entrance became a photo op for visitors, a badge of our peculiar pride. What started as my personal spat had grown into a shared triumph, a story we'd tell for years. The HOA, under its new leadership, leaned into the change. Meetings turned into casual gatherings, less about fines, more about swapping ideas over coffee. The lawn ornament rules repeal wasn't just a win for gnomes, it cracked open a door for creativity. Flamingos popped up one summer, a Santa inflatable grinned from a roof in July, Corinne's slippery slope fears come true, but nobody minded. My yard, though, stayed the gold standard, a chaotic masterpiece of beards and fishing rods that dared anyone to challenge its reign. I'd catch strangers slowing their cars, pointing, sometimes hopping out to snap a picture with the fishing gnome crew by the mailbox. Kids invented games around them, weaving tales of gnome kings and secret missions. It was absurdly perfect. My petty revenge had birthed a little world of its own, and I loved every second of tending it. I often wondered about Corinne, picturing her in some new suburb eyeing lawns with that same pinched glare. Did she flinch at every gnome she passed, haunted by Gnomeville's echo? That note I'd left, "May this gnome bring you luck," was a barb, sure, but part of me hoped it stuck with her, a reminder of the war she'd lost. Back here, her absence was a gift that kept giving. The neighborhood didn't just recover, it thrived, unshackled from her rules. My rebellion had lit a spark, and while the fire had settled, its warmth lingered. I'd sit on my porch at dusk, beer in hand, watching the sun dip behind my ceramic army. The original gnome, my grandmother's gift, held court by the flower bed, its grin unchanged, as if it knew it had kicked off something unstoppable. "You're the real hero," I'd mutter, raising my bottle to it, and in the quiet it felt true. The seasons rolled on, and the gnomes weathered them all, rain, snow, summer heat, standing firm like the rebellion they'd sparked. Neighbors moved out, new ones moved in, but the gnomes stayed, a quirky inheritance passed down with each sale. I'd overhear snippets at barbecues. "Yeah, it all started with one guy and a fine." The story grew taller, my role fuzzier, but I didn't mind. It wasn't about me anymore. It was about what we'd built, a little pocket of freedom carved out of Corinne's control. One evening, as I adjusted a toppled gnome after a storm, Mrs. Thompson ambled over, her own gnome tucked under her arm. "You changed this place, you know," she said, nodding at my yard. I shrugged, smiling. "Just gave it a nudge," she laughed. "A nudge with an army." We stood there, gazing at the bearded legion, and I felt it, a quiet, lasting win. The gnomes had done more than win a fight, they'd rewritten the rules. As time stretched on, Gnomeville became more than a neighborhood quirk. It turned into a quiet legend, a tale whispered beyond our block's borders. My yard, still the pulsing heart of it all, drew curious eyes from near and far, delivery drivers snapping pics, kids begging parents to detour past the gnome house. The original rebellion faded into folklore, but the gnomes stood firm, their numbers steady, their grins unyielding. New neighbors embraced the tradition, adding their own bearded recruits, while old-timers like Mrs. Thompson kept the spirit alive with sly winks and knowing nods. The HOA stayed tame, its new leaders content to let us breathe, and the Gnomeville sign weathered every season, a battered but proud sentinel at our gates. What I'd kicked off with one fine and a mischievous streak had rooted deep, a living monument to standing up or planting down against petty power. Corinne's ghost lingered only in memory, a cautionary tale swapped over beers at summer cookouts. I'd imagine her somewhere, maybe terrorizing a fresh suburb, but always with that gnome I'd left on her step lurking in her mind. A tiny, ceramic scar. Here, her old house swapped owners again, each family tossing a gnome into the yard like a rite of passage. The block hummed with life, unshackled from her reign, and my lawn remained the crown jewel. Hundreds of gnomes in chaotic harmony, fishing rods and lanterns glinting in the sun. I tended them like a gardener with a secret, tweaking their spots, adding a stray recruit now and then. Kids still wove stories around them, neighbors still chuckled, and I still sat on my porch, beer in hand, marveling at how far one $200 fine had carried me. It wasn't just revenge anymore. It was a legacy, small but stubborn, etched into the soil. The seasons spun forward, and the gnomes endured, chipped by storms, faded by sun, but never toppling. They'd outlasted Corinne, outlasted her rules, and in their quiet way, they'd outlast me too. One crisp evening, as I sipped my beer and watched the light fade, a young couple strolled by, pausing to gawk. "Heard this all started over some HOA fight," the guy said, loud enough for me to catch. I grinned, tipping my bottle their way. "Something like that." They laughed, snapped a photo, and moved on, leaving me with my army. The original gnome, my grandmother's gift, sat by the flower bed, its fishing rod steady, its grin as sharp as ever. "You and me, little guy," I murmured. "We did all right." It didn't answer, but it didn't need to. Its victory was carved across the block, in every gnome that dotted every lawn. In the end, it wasn't about the fight or even the win. It was about what stayed behind. Gnomeville wasn't just a place. It was a feeling, a middle finger to control freaks everywhere, a proof that a little mischief could shift the world. Corinne had lost not just her title but her grip on us all, and wherever she'd landed, she'd know the gnomes had triumphed. I leaned back, the night settling over my empire, and felt a deep, easy peace. The neighborhood had changed forever, freer and weirder for it, and my ceramic warriors stood guard, eternal and unbowed. What started as a jab at one woman's rules had grown into something bigger, something mine but not mine, a shared, silly, glorious stand. I toasted the dusk, the gnomes, and the chaos we'd wrought. They won, and they always would, long after I was gone, grinning into the future with their tiny, bearded faces.